In February 1979, the illusion of communist solidarity collapsed along the mountainous frontier between China and Vietnam, when the People's Republic of China launched a sudden, large-scale invasion of northern Vietnam, initiating a short but exceptionally violent war that exposed the depth of ideological fracture within the communist world and demonstrated how revolutionary unity had given way to rivalry, coercion, and naked state interest by the late Cold War. The conflict did not emerge spontaneously, but was the culmination of years of deteriorating relations shaped by shifting alliances, border disputes, and competing visions of leadership in Asia, as Vietnam, fresh from its victory in reunifying the country in 1975, increasingly aligned itself with the Soviet Union, while China, under the strategic recalibration led by Deng Xiaoping, sought to reassert regional influence and counter what Beijing perceived as encirclement by a hostile Soviet-backed axis. The roots of the war lay in the late 1960s and early 1970s, when the Sino-Soviet split fractured the communist bloc into rival centers of power, forcing smaller revolutionary states to navigate an increasingly polarized ideological landscape, and Vietnam's choice to deepen ties with Moscow after reunification placed it squarely on the opposite side of Beijing's strategic divide. This alignment was reinforced by Vietnam's growing conflict with Cambodia, where the Khmer Rouge regime, backed by China, clashed violently with Vietnamese forces along the border, culminating in Vietnam's full-scale invasion of Cambodia in late 1978 and the overthrow of a Chinese-aligned government, an act Beijing interpreted not only as regional aggression, but as a direct challenge to its credibility and influence. For Chinese leaders, Vietnam's actions threatened to establish a Soviet-supported power on China's southern flank, undermining Beijing's efforts to stabilize its periphery while pursuing economic reform and diplomatic normalization with the United States. And the decision to use force was framed internally as a limited punitive operation intended to teach Vietnam a lesson rather than to occupy territory or overthrow the regime in Hanoi. This framing was critical as it shaped the operational design of the invasion, which emphasized speed, brutality, and demonstrative punishment over sustained engagement, reflecting Beijing's desire to signal resolve without becoming entangled in a prolonged war that could drain resources or invite broader confrontation with the Soviet Union. On 17th of February 1979, Chinese forces crossed the border at multiple points along a wide front, attacking Vietnamese positions in the provinces of Lang Son, Cao Bang, and Lao Cai, employing massed infantry assaults supported by artillery in a campaign that harked back to earlier forms of warfare and revealed both the strengths and weaknesses of the People's Liberation Army at a moment of institutional transition. Vietnamese defenses, composed largely of local militia, border guards, and regional units rather than the main forces hardened by decades of fighting against the United States, nevertheless proved resilient, leveraging difficult terrain, prepared positions, and combat experience to impose heavy casualties on the advancing Chinese troops. The fighting was intense and often brutal, characterized by close-quarters combat in towns and mountain passes, widespread destruction of infrastructure, and significant civilian displacement, as Chinese forces systematically targeted border settlements and logistical nodes to maximize the psychological and material impact of the invasion. Despite initial advances and the capture of several provincial capitals, the Chinese military encountered serious difficulties, including coordination problems, outdated equipment, and high casualty rates that exposed deficiencies in training and command, shortcomings that Chinese leaders would later cite as justification for sweeping military reforms. Throughout the campaign, Beijing maintained that its objectives were limited and time-bound, and after several weeks of heavy fighting, Chinese forces announced that their goals had been achieved and began a staged withdrawal, leaving behind devastated border regions and a clear signal that the era of communist unity had decisively ended. The Soviet Union, bound to Vietnam by treaty but unwilling to risk a direct military confrontation with China, responded with heightened alerts, logistical support, and symbolic demonstrations of solidarity rather than direct intervention, underscoring the constraints of alliance commitments in a fragmented communist world and highlighting the degree to which the Cold War's internal divisions now shaped outcomes as much as superpower rivalry with the West. For Vietnam, the war reinforced a siege mentality and validated its reliance on Soviet backing, even as it revealed the costs of regional ambition and the vulnerability of its northern border, compelling Hanoi to maintain large forces along the frontier for years after the fighting ended. For China, the conflict served multiple purposes, punishing Vietnam, signaling resolve to Moscow and regional states, and providing a stark assessment of the PLA's readiness at a time when Beijing was reorienting its national strategy toward modernization and selective engagement with the global system. Internationally, the Sino-Vietnamese War confounded expectations that ideological affinity would constrain conflict within the communist bloc, demonstrating instead that nationalism, security concerns, and power politics had eclipsed revolutionary solidarity, and that the Cold War's late phase would be defined as much by conflicts among former allies as by confrontation across ideological lines. The war's brevity did not diminish its significance, as its violence and symbolism reverberated across Asia, reshaping perceptions of China's willingness to use force, Vietnam's regional role, and the limits of Soviet influence, while embedding a lasting hostility along the Sino-Vietnamese border that would outlive the immediate campaign. In this sense, the 1979 war stands as a decisive rupture, a moment when the rhetoric of socialist brotherhood gave way to the realities of state rivalry, and when a short, brutal conflict revealed the extent to which the communist world had fractured into competing centers of power, each prepared to defend its interests through war rather than ideology. In the weeks following the Chinese withdrawal, the consequences of the Sino-Vietnamese War unfolded not through diplomatic reconciliation, but through a prolonged militarization of the border and a hardening of strategic alignments that confirmed the conflict's deeper purpose as a demonstration of coercive resolve rather than territorial conquest. And for both Beijing and Hanoi, the end of major combat marked the beginning of a new phase defined by mutual suspicion, persistent skirmishing, and the institutionalization of hostility. Vietnam emerged from the fighting bloodied but unbowed, presenting the survival of its northern defenses as proof that it could withstand pressure from a larger adversary. Yet the cost was severe, as devastated border provinces, heavy casualties, and the need to maintain large forces along the frontier compounded the economic strain already imposed by the ongoing occupation of Cambodia and the broader challenges of post-war reconstruction. This strain reinforced Vietnam's dependence on the Soviet Union, which expanded military aid, training, and logistical support in the aftermath of the war, not as a prelude to direct confrontation with China, but as a means of stabilizing an ally whose strategic position now anchored Soviet influence in mainland Southeast Asia. For Beijing, the withdrawal allowed leaders to claim that punitive objectives had been met while avoiding the risks of escalation, yet the campaign's mixed performance exposed significant weaknesses within the People's Liberation Army, particularly in command coordination, combined arms integration, and modern logistics, shortcomings that were interpreted internally not as reasons to regret the war, but as evidence that military reform was urgently required. The conflict thus became a catalyst for long-planned changes within China's defense establishment, reinforcing arguments that future security depended less on mass mobilization and ideological fervor than on professionalization, technological modernization, and the ability to fight limited wars under contemporary conditions. Strategically, the war succeeded in signaling that China was prepared to use force to shape regional behavior, a message directed as much at Moscow as at Hanoi, demonstrating that Beijing would not accept a Soviet-aligned power consolidating itself along China's southern border without response. This signaling was carefully calibrated as the limited scope and duration of the invasion reduced the risk of superpower escalation while still imposing tangible costs on Vietnam, illustrating a mode of warfare suited to a multipolar communist landscape where restraint and violence were combined to manage rivalry. The Soviet response to the war highlighted these constraints as Moscow conducted large-scale military exercises, increased naval activity, and issued strong political statements in support of Vietnam, yet stopped short of direct intervention, reflecting a calculation that escalation with China over a peripheral conflict would jeopardize broader strategic stability at a time when the Soviet leadership faced its own economic and political pressures. This restraint exposed the limits of alliance guarantees within the fractured communist world, reinforcing the lesson that ideological alignment no longer ensured military backing, and that states would be left to bear the primary costs of regional conflict. Along the Sino-Vietnamese border, the aftermath of the war was marked by continued clashes, artillery exchanges, and patrol confrontations that persisted throughout the early 1980s, turning the frontier into a militarized zone where neither side sought decisive victory, but both remained prepared for renewed fighting, a condition that entrenched hostility and consumed resources without producing resolution. These low-level conflicts sustained the war's psychological impact, ensuring that the memory of 1979 remained vivid within military planning and political discourse, and preventing any rapid normalization that might undermine the strategic messages Beijing sought to convey. Regionally, the war reshaped perceptions of power and alignment, as Southeast Asian states observed that ideological labels offered little protection against force, and that China was willing to act independently of both superpowers to defend its interests, a realization that influenced regional diplomacy and contributed to a cautious reassessment of relations with Beijing. The conflict also altered Vietnam's regional standing, as its intervention in Cambodia and subsequent war with China positioned it simultaneously as a dominant military actor in Indochina and as a state under siege, complicating efforts to integrate economically and diplomatically with its neighbors. Within the broader Cold War context, the Sino-Vietnamese War underscored the degree to which the late Cold War was defined by fragmentation rather than bloc discipline, as conflicts increasingly arose within ideological camps rather than across them, forcing superpowers to manage rivalries among their nominal allies while pursuing their own strategic priorities. This fragmentation reduced the predictability of Cold War alignments, introducing new vectors of instability that operated independently of East-West confrontation and required constant recalibration by all major actors. For China, the war marked a turning point in its regional posture, reinforcing a strategy that combined selective engagement with decisive coercion and that prioritized national interest over revolutionary solidarity, a posture consistent with its broader shift toward pragmatic statecraft and economic reform. For Vietnam, the experience entrenched a defensive mindset and a reliance on external backing that would shape its foreign and security policies for years, even as the costs of isolation and militarization weighed heavily on a society exhausted by decades of conflict. Internationally, the brief but violent war challenged assumptions about the trajectory of communist states after decolonization, revealing that ideological victory did not guarantee stability or unity, and that power politics continued to govern relations even among regimes that claimed a shared revolutionary heritage. The war's brutality and brevity combined to amplify its symbolic weight, demonstrating that decisive violence could be employed for signaling purposes without devolving into total war, a lesson that would resonate in subsequent regional conflicts where limited objectives and controlled escalation became preferred tools of statecraft. As the dust settled, the Sino-Vietnamese War of 1979 stood as a stark reminder that the Cold War's late phase was not a period of ideological consolidation, but of fragmentation and realignment, in which former allies turned on one another, and the language of socialist brotherhood gave way to the realities of borders, security, and power, leaving behind a legacy of mistrust that would shape Asian geopolitics long after the guns fell silent. As the 1980s progressed, the Sino-Vietnamese War's significance became increasingly apparent, not through renewed large-scale offensives, but through the way its unresolved aftermath reshaped regional security and exposed the long-term consequences of communist fragmentation, as both China and Vietnam settled into a prolonged standoff that consumed resources, hardened attitudes, and constrained diplomatic flexibility. Along the border, sporadic clashes and artillery duels persisted, particularly in contested areas such as the highlands around Lang Son and Ha Giang, where fortified positions and overlapping claims ensured that neither side could easily disengage without appearing to concede ground, turning the frontier into a laboratory of limited conflict in which force was applied deliberately but incrementally to maintain pressure without triggering escalation. For Vietnam, the necessity of defending against China while occupying Cambodia created a dual-front burden that stretched manpower and logistics, reinforcing dependence on Soviet support and deepening isolation from much of Southeast Asia, where Hanoi was increasingly perceived as a destabilizing actor rather than a revolutionary partner. This isolation had economic consequences, as Vietnam struggled to rebuild after decades of war while maintaining a large standing army and absorbing the costs of prolonged militarization, conditions that entrenched austerity and delayed integration into regional and global markets. China, by contrast, absorbed the lessons of 1979 into a broader program of reform, using the conflict's exposure of military shortcomings to justify restructuring the People's Liberation Army, reducing its size, professionalizing its ranks, and investing selectively in modernization. Reforms that aligned with Deng Xiaoping's emphasis on national rejuvenation through economic development rather than ideological mobilization. The war thus functioned asymmetrically, imposing long-term costs on Vietnam while providing China with both a strategic warning to rivals and an internal rationale for change, reinforcing the perception that Beijing had achieved its punitive objectives even without decisive battlefield victory. At the level of ideology, the conflict accelerated the erosion of claims to socialist unity as propaganda on both sides depicted the other not as a misguided comrade, but as an aggressor serving external interests, narratives that legitimized hostility and made reconciliation politically costly. This ideological hardening was mirrored in the positions of their respective allies, with the Soviet Union continuing to back Vietnam as a means of maintaining influence in Southeast Asia while managing the risk of confrontation with China, and China strengthening ties with non-communist states and deepening engagement with the United States as part of its broader strategy to counterbalance Soviet power. The war thus intersected with the global Cold War not as a subsidiary theater, but as a vector of realignment, demonstrating how regional conflicts could reshape superpower calculations by forcing them to manage rivalries within their own ideological camps. For Southeast Asia, the persistence of Sino-Vietnamese hostility reinforced caution and hedging as states sought to avoid entanglement in great power rivalries while adjusting to the reality that ideological labels offered limited protection against coercion. The conflict's endurance also illustrated how limited wars could have disproportionate strategic effects, as the absence of resolution perpetuated insecurity and constrained policy choices long after the fighting subsided. Within Vietnam, the memory of resisting both Western and Asian adversaries reinforced a nationalist narrative that emphasized sovereignty and resilience. Yet this narrative coexisted uneasily with the economic and diplomatic isolation that resulted from prolonged confrontation, creating internal pressures that would later contribute to reassessment and reform. China's ability to disengage from sustained fighting while retaining leverage underscored a shift toward more flexible statecraft, in which force was used sparingly and strategically rather than as an instrument of ideological struggle, a shift that would characterize Beijing's approach to regional disputes in subsequent decades. Analytically, the Sino-Vietnamese War demonstrates how the late Cold War was shaped by conflicts that fell outside the traditional East-West binary, revealing a world in which power was increasingly exercised through regional coercion and alignment, rather than through global ideological confrontation. The war's legacy lay not in territorial change, but in the redefinition of relationships as it entrenched mutual suspicion, reoriented alliances, and highlighted the limits of ideological cohesion in a world where national interests dominated. By the mid-1980s, the conflict had become a background condition, influencing planning and diplomacy without dominating headlines. Yet, its presence continued to shape decisions, reminding all parties that the communist bloc had fractured irreversibly, and that the Cold War's dynamics were now driven as much by intra-bloc rivalry as by superpower confrontation. In this sense, the Sino-Vietnamese War stands as a pivotal episode in the late Cold War, illustrating how a short, brutal conflict could produce enduring strategic consequences by revealing the primacy of state interest over ideological solidarity and by reshaping the balance of power within Asia through fragmentation rather than unity. As the Cold War moved toward its final decade, the unresolved legacy of the 1979 war continued to shape the strategic environment in Asia, illustrating how a brief but intense conflict could embed itself into long-term planning and perception, even in the absence of renewed large-scale combat. And for both China and Vietnam, the standoff that followed became a structural condition rather than a transitional phase. The persistence of tension along the border served as a constant reminder that ideological alignment no longer guaranteed security, and that revolutionary credentials offered little protection against coercion when national interests diverged. A lesson that reverberated throughout the communist world and contributed to a broader erosion of ideological discipline. Vietnam's position remained particularly constrained, as the need to defend against China while sustaining its presence in Cambodia locked Hanoi into a posture of militarized isolation, limiting diplomatic options and reinforcing reliance on external support at a time when the global environment was becoming less tolerant of prolonged regional conflict. This isolation deepened the economic challenges facing Vietnam, as resources were diverted toward defense and reconstruction in border regions, while access to broader markets and investment remained restricted, creating pressures that gradually eroded the sustainability of a siege-oriented strategy. Within China, the war's aftermath reinforced a strategic outlook that prioritized stability on favorable terms, combining deterrence with selective engagement, and emphasizing the avoidance of open-ended commitments that could undermine domestic reform, a balance that reflected lessons drawn from the conflict's costs and limitations. The contrast between China's capacity to absorb the war's lessons and Vietnam's prolonged exposure to its consequences highlighted the asymmetry of outcomes, underscoring how limited wars could redistribute strategic advantage even without decisive battlefield results. Regionally, the conflict contributed to a recalibration of expectations, as Southeast Asian states observed that China was willing to employ force against a fellow socialist state to enforce its interests, reinforcing a cautious approach to relations that emphasized hedging and diversification rather than alignment. The war thus functioned as a signal beyond its immediate participants, shaping regional diplomacy by demonstrating that power politics had overtaken ideological solidarity as the primary driver of behavior. Within the broader Cold War framework, the Sino-Vietnamese confrontation complicated superpower strategy as it forced both Moscow and Washington to navigate a landscape in which their nominal partners pursued independent agendas that could not be fully controlled, reducing the predictability of bloc behavior and increasing the importance of regional dynamics. This fragmentation diminished the coherence of the Cold War system, contributing to an environment in which multiple, overlapping rivalries operated simultaneously, each with its own logic and risks. The persistence of hostility between China and Vietnam into the late 1980s illustrated the durability of conflicts rooted in security and sovereignty rather than ideology, as neither side found sufficient incentive to compromise despite changing global conditions and the gradual easing of superpower confrontation. The eventual reduction of tension would come not through decisive settlement, but through shifts in regional and domestic priorities that made prolonged confrontation increasingly costly, reflecting a pattern in which time and exhaustion, rather than victory, shaped outcomes. Analytically, the war's endurance underscores how short conflicts can cast long shadows, embedding mistrust and militarization into policy even as attention moves elsewhere, and how the Cold War's later years were marked by such lingering disputes that resisted resolution despite systemic change. The Sino-Vietnamese War, therefore, should be understood not only as a moment of violent rupture, but as a formative episode that revealed the true character of late Cold War geopolitics in Asia, a landscape defined by fractured alliances, pragmatic statecraft, and the primacy of national interest over ideological unity. As the global Cold War approached its end, the conflict stood as a reminder that some of its most enduring consequences lay in the relationships it reshaped and the assumptions it destroyed, leaving behind a region where former comrades faced one another across fortified borders, bound not by shared ideology but by mutual suspicion forged in a short, brutal war whose effects far outlasted its battles. In its final historical balance, the Sino-Vietnamese War of 1979 stands as one of the clearest demonstrations that by the late Cold War, ideology had ceased to function as a binding force within the communist world, replaced instead by a strategic environment governed by borders, security dilemmas, and the pursuit of national interest through controlled violence. The war's brevity masked its depth, as the invasion shattered any lingering assumption that socialist states would resolve disputes through solidarity or mediation, revealing instead a readiness to employ force against former comrades to enforce regional hierarchies and strategic red lines. For China, The conflict marked a decisive assertion that revolutionary legitimacy no longer conferred immunity, and that Beijing would act unilaterally to counter perceived encirclement and challenge Soviet influence, even at the cost of intra-communist warfare, a posture that aligned with its broader transition toward pragmatic statecraft and selective engagement rather than ideological leadership. For Vietnam, the war confirmed both its military resilience and its strategic vulnerability, reinforcing dependence on Soviet support while imposing long-term economic and security burdens that constrained autonomy and delayed normalization with its neighbors. The Soviet Union's restrained response underscored the limits of alliance guarantees in a fragmented bloc, exposing the reality that even formal treaties could not compel intervention when the risks of escalation outweighed the value of solidarity, and highlighting how superpower rivalry increasingly involved managing conflicts among allies rather than directing them. Regionally, the war reshaped perceptions of power and intent, signaling to Southeast Asia that China's rise would be accompanied by coercive capability as well as diplomatic engagement, and that ideological affinity offered little protection against strategic calculation, lessons that encouraged hedging, diversification, and caution in regional diplomacy. Analytically, the conflict illustrates how the late Cold War was defined less by binary confrontation than by splintering centers of power, where limited wars served as instruments of signaling and adjustment within a multipolar ideological landscape. The Sino-Vietnamese War did not redraw maps or produce decisive victory, yet it redefined relationships, hardened borders, and accelerated the erosion of communist unity more effectively than any theoretical dispute, replacing shared revolutionary language with the realities of armed rivalry. Its enduring significance lies in how it revealed the true structure of late Cold War geopolitics, a system in which former allies confronted one another through calibrated violence. Superpowers exercised restraint rather than command, and ideology yielded to the primacy of state survival and regional dominance. As such, the war stands not as an anomaly, but as a defining episode, demonstrating that by 1979, the Cold War's most consequential fractures ran not only between East and West, but through the heart of the communist world itself, leaving behind a legacy of mistrust and militarization that would persist long after the gunfire along the Sino-Vietnamese border had ceased.